Marie Langford was once seen as the grieving widow who never stopped searching for her missing husband. But when the FBI matched DNA from a discarded coffee cup, they uncovered a chilling truth: Thomas Langford never left home that day, and Marie had been hiding his body and her secret for 22 years. Thomas Langford was a man of steady routines and quiet brilliance. At 41, he had built a life that most would consider enviable. A stable job as an environmental scientist, a loving wife named Marie, 2 children in middle school, and a well-kept home in the peaceful suburbs of Ashfield, Oregon. Every weekday morning, he left at precisely 7:10 a.m., coffee thermos in hand, and returned by 6:700 p.m., unless his fieldwork ran longer than expected. That made the events of May 2, 2003 all the more jarring. On that morning, Thomas left the house as usual, but that evening he never came home. Marie reported him missing the next day. She told the police he had mentioned a work trip to the Columbia River to gather sediment samples and likely lost track of time. She said she wasn't alarmed at first, but when night fell and there were no calls, no texts, and his phone went straight to voicemail, panic began to set in. Police found his vehicle 2 days later parked along a turnout near the river. The keys were still in the ignition, the driver's door unlocked. His wallet was inside, untouched. The only things missing were Thomas and his work bag. Authorities launched a search operation, suspecting he may have slipped into the river while working or gone for a walk and become injured. Divers combed the water for weeks, and cadaver dogs scarred the shoreline, but no trace of him was ever found. From the outside, Marie handled the tragedy with grace. She spoke to the media, tearfully pleading for help in finding her husband. She organized search parties and coordinated with the police, providing photos and records of his routines. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles and condolences, deeply moved by her strength. Her children, confused and grieving, clung to her for support. When the search eventually dwindled and public interest faded, Marie held a memorial for Thomas. Even though there was no body, she said it helped the children process what had happened. She filed for a death certificate 1 year later, and after that, life seemed to slowly move forward. The case officially went cold in 2004. Without a body, without evidence of foul play, there was little the police could do. They suspected accidental drowning or even suicide, but had no definitive proof of either. Thomas's disappearance was listed as suspicious but unresolved. His family mourned. His children grew up. Marie remained in the same house for a few more years before selling it and relocating to Portland. She told people she needed a fresh start. She kept Thomas's name alive on social media with the occasional remembrance post. Every few years, she would appear in local interviews when reporters revisited the cold case. Each time she presented the same image, a heartbroken woman still waiting for answers. But in the quiet corners of the original investigation, there were always lingering doubts. A few officers had wondered why Thomas never contacted anyone before vanishing. His phone records showed no unusual calls. His finances had been stable, and Marie's grief, while believable, had struck some as performative. Still, lacking any real evidence or leads, the case remained shelved, stored away in the Ashfield Police Department's basement archive room, just another file in a cabinet marked unsolved. What no one knew, what even the most seasoned detectives hadn't realized, was that Thomas Langford had never left his home that morning. He had never reached the Columbia River, and he had never disappeared by accident. His final moments had occurred behind the closed doors of his very own house, in the early hours before dawn, while his children were still asleep and the neighborhood remained silent. The truth was buried, both figuratively and literally, beneath years of lies and layers of soil in the backyard garden, and it would remain hidden for 22 years, until a single coffee cup, discarded without a second thought, began to unravel everything. More than 2 decades after Thomas Langford's disappearance, his name was barely remembered outside the small circle of people directly affected by it. Cold cases like his rarely saw new developments. That changed in early 2025 when the FBI began a broad initiative to retest DNA evidence from thousands of unsolved cases across the country, using upgraded forensic technology and genealogical tracing. The agency's National Cold Case Unit, recently funded by a federal grant, was tasked with reviewing dormant files for any biological materials that had been collected but never properly processed due to the limitations of the time. One of those files, dusty and long forgotten in the Ashfield Police Department's archive, belonged to Thomas Langford. Inside the evidence box was a small vial labeled "Unknown Blood Sample, Garden Shed." The original 2003 report mentioned that officers had collected it after finding a dark stain on the concrete floor during a cursory search of the Langford property. But without a body or other signs of violence, and with Marie's insistence that her husband had simply left for work that morning, the sample had been set aside as likely unrelated. It had sat in cold storage ever since, overlooked as the case went cold. Now, with new resources and technology, it was about to become the key to unlocking a long-hidden truth. At the same time, in a completely unrelated case, another team within the FBI was working on an investigation into interstate bank fraud involving synthetic identities. One woman under surveillance, a middle-aged librarian named Marissa Dalton, had been quietly flagged for unusual financial activity. She had no criminal history, no violent record, and had lived a quiet life in Portland for over 15 years. Still, investigators were following protocol and gathering information. Surveillance teams shadowed her, hoping to uncover evidence linking her to the identity theft ring they were pursuing. During one of these routine operations, agents collected a coffee cup she had discarded at a train station trash bin. It was standard practice in such cases. They were simply trying to build a DNA profile for confirmation. They had no idea what they had just stumbled upon. When the DNA was entered into the national database, the results triggered an unexpected alert. The system flagged a partial familial match, not to the fraud case, but to the long, cold Langford file. Specifically, the DNA from the coffee cup shared genetic markers with the unidentified blood sample found in the Langford garden shed over 2 decades earlier. It was an improbable connection. But the algorithm was precise, and when analysts cross-checked the information, a chilling truth emerged. Marissa Dalton didn't exist before 2008. Her social security number and birth records were legitimate on paper, but were traced to a deceased woman from another state. The real identity of the woman being surveilled was Marie Langford, the widow of Thomas Langford. She had changed her name legally through a forged identity broker and had built an entirely new life for herself in another city. For years, she had lived unnoticed, under the radar, escaping any suspicion. The realization rippled through the FBI with urgency. The agents working the financial case immediately looped in the cold case unit, who began digging into Marie's history. They reviewed the original disappearance reports, the autopsy suggestions, and the untested evidence. With the new DNA match and confirmation that the woman now calling herself Marissa was actually Marie, investigators had what they needed to escalate the case. They re-interviewed old neighbors, re-examined financial documents, and began preparing for a search warrant of the property where Thomas and Marie had lived. It was a monumental turning point. For 22 years, Marie had been seen as a grieving wife. Her deception had been airtight, until a moment of carelessness with a paper coffee cup tore through decades of lies. The technology that didn't exist in 2003 was now rapidly catching up with her past. What was once speculation now became a direct path to the truth. All it took was a single strand of DNA to awaken a long-buried crime, and to start the fall of a woman who had gotten away with murder for far too long. The Langford residence, now painted a neutral beige with a vegetable garden in the backyard, had changed hands 3 times since 2003. Families had come and gone, unaware of the history buried beneath their feet. When the FBI's cold case unit arrived with a warrant in 2025, the current owners were stunned. They cooperated fully, allowing forensic teams to scan and dig the backyard, specifically the area near the old shed foundation and the garden plot Marie once tended with pride. What began as a quiet re-investigation quickly escalated into one of the most critical cold case breakthroughs in Oregon's history. On the 3rd day of excavation, a ground-penetrating radar scan detected an anomaly roughly 4 feet below the soil. The team marked off the area and began to dig with precision. Hours passed, and then a gloved hand froze mid-scoop. A piece of thick, torn plastic emerged, tightly wrapped and weathered from years underground. As the soil was cleared further, the shape beneath the plastic became unmistakable. Human remains, a partial skeleton with remnants of decayed clothing, bones curled in an unnatural position. The discovery sent a chill through the entire operation. They had found Thomas Langford. Crime scene analysts handled the excavation with painstaking care, photographing every inch and preserving any trace evidence. The remains were transported for forensic analysis. Despite the passage of time, dental records quickly confirmed the identity. The missing scientist had never left his home as believed. He had been murdered and buried in his own backyard. But even more disturbing than the burial itself were the items found with him. Resting beside the skeleton was a rusted hammer, its handle still faintly stained with aged, dried blood. The murder weapon had been buried along with the body, perhaps hastily or perhaps with confidence that it would never be found. Also discovered beneath a nearby paving stone was a sealed plastic envelope. Inside, a folded and yellowed piece of notebook paper, water-damaged, but still legible, contained a note. Handwriting analysts would later confirm it matched samples from Marie Langford. The note wasn't a confession, but it was revealing. Phrases like, "I can't keep pretending," "We'll take everything," and "There's only one way left," were scrawled in hurried ink. Investigators speculated it had been written in the hours or days leading up to the murder, never meant to be found, and ultimately buried either by panic or design. The forensics team determined the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the damage the hammer could have inflicted. The pattern of fractures told a grim story. Thomas had likely been struck multiple times in the head. The position of the body suggested he may have been moved shortly after death and wrapped hastily. There were no defensive wounds, indicating he was probably attacked from behind or while asleep. The evidence pointed to premeditation. This was not a moment of rage, it was planned. As the FBI pieced together the scene, more elements emerged. Financial records from 2003 showed that Marie had taken out several life insurance policies on Thomas months before his disappearance, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. Investigators had previously missed or dismissed the significance due to the lack of physical evidence. Now, combined with the discovery of the body and the murder weapon, the entire picture came into view. Marie had staged a disappearance to cover up a calculated killing. Perhaps the most haunting part of the discovery was how normal everything above the burial site had remained. Over the years, children had played in the yard, vegetables had been planted, grass mowed, holidays celebrated. Life had gone on while Thomas Langford's grave sat hidden under soil and roots. It was a garden tended with care and silence. The evidence was irrefutable. A body, a weapon, a note, DNA that led them there. The case that once lacked direction now had a narrative of betrayal and hidden violence. And at the center of it all stood the woman who had once been seen as a grieving widow, now poised to face the truth that had been buried along with her husband. As the investigation progressed, the FBI and local authorities began reconstructing the years leading up to Thomas Langford's death with chilling clarity. The image of Marie Langford as a devoted wife began to erode rapidly. Financial, personal, and behavioral patterns began surfacing, painting a vastly different portrait of the woman who had once been seen as a pillar of resilience during a family tragedy. Beneath the carefully composed surface, she had been unraveling for years, and no one had noticed. Detectives sifted through banking records, insurance documents, and personal correspondences that had once seemed irrelevant. One glaring piece of evidence stood out 6 months before Thomas's disappearance. Marie had taken out 2 separate life insurance policies on him. One was through his employer, a standard policy for families, but the second was private and unusually large. The policy, taken out quietly without informing Thomas's employer or close relatives, amounted to nearly $500,000. Investigators confirmed the policies had paid out within a year of Thomas's declared death. The funds were used to pay off the mortgage, purchase a new vehicle, and quietly relocate to a small house outside Portland. At the time, Marie had told friends she needed a change of scenery for the children's sake. No one questioned it. Even more revealing were Thomas's last known movements. His colleagues at the Environmental Research Agency recalled him acting withdrawn in the months before his disappearance. He had spoken to one trusted coworker about marital issues, hinting that Marie had grown increasingly controlling and erratic. He had even mentioned consulting a lawyer, asking discreet questions about divorce and asset protection. The coworker didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just a rough patch. But looking back now, that conversation took on an ominous new meaning. Thomas had been preparing to separate, and Marie had likely found out. The forensic analysis of the note found beneath the paving stone offered more psychological insight. Experts described it as a disjointed emotional dump, a letter written in frustration, possibly fear, and desperation. Phrases like, "They'll leave and ruin me," and "I won't lose everything I've built," pointed toward a motive steeped in control and financial panic. Marie had become dependent not just on Thomas's income, but on the lifestyle and social image their marriage provided. The thought of losing it all, and possibly facing public shame, may have triggered her plan. The note never directly stated an intention to kill, but in the context of the crime, it was damning. Investigators also discovered that shortly after Thomas's disappearance, Marie had given away his clothes and belongings, an act many grieving families delay for emotional reasons. She had done it swiftly, even before the body had been declared legally dead. She had told people it was part of her healing process, that she needed to remove daily reminders of her loss. At the time, it sounded reasonable. In hindsight, it looked like she was erasing him. Neighbors from their old street remembered the night before Thomas vanished. One mentioned hearing raised voices coming from the Langford home, followed by an eerie silence. Another recalled seeing Marie moving garbage bags to the side of the house unusually late, around 1 a.m., something she had never done before. No one thought to report it. In a peaceful suburban neighborhood like Ashfield, people didn't expect murder to be hiding next door. The most sobering detail was the timeline. Marie had kept the secret for 22 years. She had carried it through job interviews, PTA meetings, birthday parties, and neighborhood barbecues. She had smiled in photos with her children, made donations to local causes, and attended public vigils for missing persons, all while knowing exactly where her husband's body lay. There were no slip-ups, no confessions, no whispered regrets. Just a meticulously controlled life wrapped around a terrible lie. By the time the FBI completed its investigation, the puzzle was complete. Marie Langford had killed her husband not in a moment of rage, but as part of a cold, premeditated strategy to secure her own future. It wasn't just murder. It was the calculated destruction of a man who had planned to walk away. And she almost got away with it. Almost. The arrest came quietly on a rainy Tuesday morning in Portland. Marie Langford, or Marissa Dalton, as her neighbors knew her, was taken into custody without incident as she left a corner coffee shop near her apartment. She wore a beige raincoat and carried a paperback novel in her tote bag. She looked nothing like the woman in the old newspaper clippings from 2003, but the DNA didn't lie. After 22 years, the truth had surfaced, and it had come for her in the most ordinary moment of her carefully constructed life. News of the arrest spread rapidly. Within hours, headlines across Oregon carried the story of a cold case finally solved, a husband buried in his own backyard, and a widow turned suspect. Former neighbors from Ashfield were stunned. Marie had always seemed kind, even fragile, in the wake of her husband's disappearance. But those who knew her well began re-examining their memories. The long stretches of emotional distance, the quiet control she exerted over social interactions, the way she deflected any conversation about Thomas after the first year. It all began to fit together in hindsight. Marie was charged with first-degree murder, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice, and desecration of human remains. During the arraignment, she appeared composed, almost mechanical, offering only brief responses. She entered a plea of not guilty. Her defense attorney claimed the evidence was circumstantial and questioned the integrity of the forensic process given the time lapse. But prosecutors were confident. They had physical evidence. The remains, the murder weapon, the blood in the shed. They had financial motives, behavioral red flags, and most damning of all, the DNA trail that had led directly to her. The prosecution's case was built like a fortress. The trial began 6 months later. It captivated the public. Media outlets dubbed it the Garden Grave case, and true crime forums exploded with speculation and commentary. Thomas's children, now adults in their 30s, attended the proceedings, stoic but visibly shaken. For years, they had lived with unanswered questions, carrying the quiet burden of unresolved grief. Learning that their mother had orchestrated the very tragedy they mourned was a wound deeper than they could express. Witness after witness took the stand. Forensic experts detailed how the remains were recovered, how the hammer matched the trauma on the skull, how the garden soil patterns confirmed the timing of the burial. A DNA analyst explained how the coffee cup led to the breakthrough, emphasizing that the match to the blood sample from the garden shed was statistically indisputable. Former colleagues spoke about Thomas's intentions to leave the marriage. Financial advisors presented a timeline showing how quickly Marie had moved to cash out the insurance policies. Neighbors recounted the strange behaviors they'd noticed, behaviors that once seemed harmless but now appeared chilling in context. Marie sat silently through most of the trial, her expression unreadable. When given the chance to testify, she declined. She showed no visible emotion when photographs of her husband's remains were shown to the court. She never once looked toward her children. To the jury, it was a portrait of someone who had long since severed themselves from remorse. Deliberations didn't take long. After just 4 hours, the jury returned with a verdict guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marie Langford had taken a life, staged a disappearance, and buried the evidence beneath her garden. Now she would spend the rest of her days behind bars. In the weeks that followed, the community of Ashfield held a memorial for Thomas Langford, finally able to mourn him properly. His children gave statements expressing a complex blend of relief, sorrow, and betrayal. Closure, they said, did not erase pain, but it gave their father the dignity he had long been denied. The backyard where Thomas was found was transformed into a memorial garden by the new homeowners, a quiet reminder of a life lost and a mystery solved. It was a case that proved time doesn't always bury the truth. Sometimes, it only delays its arrival. And in the end, it wasn't an eyewitness, a confession, or a stroke of luck that exposed the killer. It was a simple coffee cup, tossed away without thought, that finally delivered justice after 22 silent years.